Won the night he didn't turn around. He heard her say his name. He just didn't turn around. If you've ever loved someone who stayed but was never really there, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Some stories don't shout, they whisper, and this one might sound like yours. It was late enough for the city to soften. The kind of night where headlights blur into quiet gold streaks, and even arguments feel tired. Clara stood near the doorway. Her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her sweater. Not dramatic, not shaking, just bracing. Ethan? She didn't raise her voice. She never did. He was 3 steps ahead of her, keys already in his hand, phone lighting up his jawline with a pale glow. He paused, not fully, just enough for his body to register the sound. He heard her. You could see it in the way his shoulders tightened for half a second. But he didn't turn. And sometimes, that's how abandonment begins. Not with slammed doors, not with someone leaving, but with someone choosing not to face you. Clara wasn't asking for a miracle. She wasn't asking him to stay forever. She just wanted him to look at her, really look, before walking out into another night of unfinished conversations. Can we talk? She asked. Softer this time. He exhaled, the kind of exhale that sounds patient but feels distant. Not tonight, I'm exhausted. And he was, just not from the right things. The door opened, cool air slipped between them. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Clara didn't cry, she didn't chase him down the hallway. She just stood there, absorbing the silence he left behind. Because what hurt wasn't that he left. It was that he stayed long enough to hear her. And still chose not to turn around. Later, she would replay that moment over and over. The way his back looked. The hesitation that almost happened. Almost. But in love, almost can become a lifetime. That night wasn't loud. There was no explosion, no betrayal. Just a quiet shift. A fracture so small it didn't make a sound. And yet, everything after that night would echo with it. Two love without presence. They still said, I love you. That was the confusing part. Ethan would kiss her forehead before leaving for work. He would text her around noon. He would bring home her favorite wine on Fridays without being reminded. From the outside, it looked steady, safe, functional. But presence is not the same as proximity. He sat across from her at dinner, nodding at the right moments, asking about her day in the way someone asks out of habit. Not hunger. His eyes would flicker back to his phone. Not urgently, just reflexively. Clara learned to read those micro-pauses. The half-second delay before he answered. The way his shoulders turned slightly away, even while he was still sitting beside her. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He just wasn't there. And that absence, the invisible kind, is harder to fight. One night she tried again. I feel like you're somewhere else, she said carefully, choosing each word as if it might break. He looked genuinely surprised. I'm right here, he replied. And he believed it. That was the fracture neither of them knew how to name. For Ethan, love meant provision, stability, loyalty. He had never been taught that love also meant eye contact that lingers. Listening that leans in, silence that feels shared instead of empty. So he offered what he knew. He fixed things, paid bills early, booked vacations months ahead. He thought consistency was intimacy. But Clara didn't need efficiency. She needed to be felt. There were nights when they lay in the same bed, their backs almost touching, and Clara could feel the warmth of his body, but not the warmth of his attention. She would stare into the dark and wonder how two people could be so physically close and still feel miles apart. She began to shrink her needs without announcing it. Stopped asking deeper questions. Stopped reaching for his hand when he seemed distracted. Stopped saying, "Can you stay with me for a minute?" Because every time she reached and met air, something inside her quieted a little more. Love without presence doesn't explode. It erodes. Slowly, politely, respectfully. Until one day you realize you've been starving next to a full table. And the hardest part? He still thought everything was fine. Free the silence between words. There are silences that feel peaceful. And then there are silences that feel like something is slowly leaving the room. Theirs was the second kind. At dinner, the clink of silverware became louder than their conversation. The hum of the refrigerator filled spaces where laughter used to live. Ethan would ask, "How was your day?" in the same tone someone uses to check the weather. Predictable, polite, already half gone. Clara would start to answer, something small at first. A story about a coworker. A moment that made her uneasy. A feeling she couldn't quite name. She would watch his eyes. They were open, attentive, even. But not anchored. Sometimes he nodded before she finished speaking, as if to move the moment along gently, not dismissing her, just smoothing the edges. And the strangest part? He truly believed he was listening. That's what made the silence heavier. It wasn't absence. It was partial presence. Like a radio station slightly out of tune. You hear the music, but it never fully lands. One night, she stopped mid-sentence. And I just felt. She paused. Ethan didn't notice. He was scrolling, not urgently, not hiding, just drifting. Clara finished the sentence in her head instead. That was the first time she realized she was having full conversations alone. The words still left her mouth. But the connection didn't return. Later, lying in bed, she whispered into the dark, "Do you ever feel far away?" He shifted beside her. "I'm right here," he murmured, already half asleep. And she believed him. Physically, he was inches away. Emotionally, he felt like a distant shoreline she could see but never reach. The silence between them wasn't loud. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand. It just stretched. Across rooms. Across days. Across moments that should have felt shared. Clara began editing herself. Shorter answers. Fewer vulnerable admissions. Less risk. Because every time she opened something tender and felt it land nowhere. A quiet message formed inside her. Maybe this is too much. Maybe I am too much. And that's how silence rewrites you. Not by force. But by repetition. Until you stop speaking the parts of yourself that echo. And the hardest truth? He never intended to create that silence. He just never learned how to enter it with her. For what abandonment really is. Abandonment is rarely dramatic. It doesn't always come with a suitcase by the door or a final goodbye echoing down a hallway. Sometimes, abandonment is subtle. It happens while both people are still sharing a bed. Clara used to believe that being left meant someone physically walking away. That it would be obvious, loud, clear enough to point it and say, "There, that's when it ended." But what she was feeling didn't look like that. Ethan still came home every night. He still texted her when he landed. He still said, "Drive safe." Nothing was missing on the surface. And yet, something essential was gone. Abandonment, she began to realize, is not the act of leaving. It's the act of withholding. Withholding curiosity. Withholding emotional risk. Withholding the willingness to turn toward someone when they're reaching. She would sit beside him on the couch, their knees almost touching, and feel a loneliness so quiet it frightened her. How could you feel alone next to the person you love? That was the question she didn't know how to ask without sounding ungrateful. Because Ethan wasn't cruel. He didn't shout. He didn't disappear for days. He didn't betray her. He simply stayed at a distance. And that distance, over time, began to shape her nervous system. Her voice softened when she brought up something vulnerable. Her heart raced before difficult conversations. Her body anticipated dismissal even before it happened. That's the invisible architecture of abandonment. It teaches you to expect disconnection. Not because someone told you directly, but because every attempt at depth meets a polite wall. One evening she said, "I miss you." Ethan looked confused. "I'm right here." Again. He wasn't wrong. He just wasn't understanding the language she was speaking. She didn't miss his body. She missed being met. Being seen without having to explain the feeling 3 times. Being held in the pause instead of rushed through it. Real abandonment, she understood now, is when your emotions have nowhere to land. When you keep throwing pieces of your heart into the space between you, and they fall to the floor unheard. And slowly, you stop throwing. Not because you don't feel, but because you've learned it's safer to hold it alone. 5. His childhood pattern. Ethan didn't wake up one morning and decide to be distant. Distance was something he learned. In his childhood home, emotions were treated like weather, acknowledged briefly, then endured in silence. His father believed strength meant control. His mother believed peace meant not asking for more. No one yelled, no one slammed doors. But no one lingered either. If Ethan cried, his father would place a steady hand on his shoulder and say, "You're okay," not as a question, as a command. If he felt afraid, he learned to swallow it quickly. If he felt hurt, he learned to call it motivation. Feelings were inconvenient. Success was measurable. So Ethan became measurable. Straight A's, scholarships, promotions before 30. He mastered environments where outcomes could be predicted and earned. But intimacy doesn't follow spreadsheets. Clara sometimes wondered what little Ethan looked like when he was sad. Did anyone kneel down and ask him what was wrong? Did anyone sit with him in the pause? Or did they rush him toward composure? When Clara said, "I feel alone," Ethan heard accusation. Because growing up, emotions were problems to solve, not spaces to enter. He didn't know how to sit in someone else's vulnerability without feeling like he was failing. So he defaulted to what he understood. Fix it. Minimize it. Reassure it away. "I'm not going anywhere," he would say. And he meant it. He just didn't realize that staying physically was not the same as staying emotionally available. As a child, Ethan learned that love meant reliability. You show up. You provide. You don't break. But he never learned that love also means exposure. Letting someone see the parts of you that aren't impressive, the fears that don't fit a resume, the confusion that doesn't resolve neatly. Every time Clara asked him to go deeper, something inside him tightened. Not because he didn't care, but because depth felt like drowning. And drowning, in his childhood, meant no one was coming to help. So he built walls that looked like calm. He built composure that looked like maturity. He built independence that looked like strength. And Clara mistook those walls for distance. He mistook her longing for instability. 2 different survival patterns, colliding quietly in the same room. Neither of them villains. Just shaped by histories that never learned how to meet. 6. The moment she started shrinking. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic declaration. No conscious decision. Clara didn't wake up one morning and think, "I will make myself smaller today." It was quieter than that. It started the night she reached for his hand and felt him gently pull away, not rudely. Not sharply, just absent-mindedly. As if her touch had arrived at the wrong time. He didn't even notice. She did. And something inside her adjusted. The next time she wanted to ask a deeper question, she rephrased it into something safer. Instead of, "Are you happy with us?" she asked, "How was work?" Instead of, "I feel far from you lately," she said, "You seem tired." She began translating her needs into observations. It felt mature, thoughtful, considerate. But underneath that maturity was fear. Fear that asking directly would make her seem demanding. Fear that her longing would feel like pressure. Fear that if she reached too far, she would confirm what she was already beginning to suspect, that she was reaching alone. So she adapted. She laughed sooner. She apologized faster. She softened her tone before he even reacted. Her nervous system learned to scan his face before speaking. Is he distracted? Is this a good time? Is this too much? And slowly, she started editing herself in real time. She cut off stories before they became emotional. She swallowed tears before they became visible. She reassured him before he could feel uncomfortable. It was subtle, almost invisible. From the outside, she looked calm, balanced, easy to love. But shrinking is exhausting. Because every time you fold yourself inward, you're holding pieces of yourself that want to expand. There were moments when she caught her reflection and barely recognized the quietness in her eyes. Not sadness. Restraint. She told herself she was being patient. She told herself love requires compromise. She told herself he would open up when he felt safe. But what she didn't admit, not yet, was that she had begun to measure her worth by how little space she took up. The less she needed, the safer the relationship felt. The quieter she became, the fewer waves there were. And she mistook calm water for connection. That was the moment she started shrinking. Not because he asked her to, but because survival whispered, "This is how you stay." 7. Becoming easy to love. Clara didn't decide to disappear. She decided to become easier. Easier to understand. Easier to reassure. Easier to love. It started with small edits. She stopped bringing up the nights she felt lonely. Stopped asking if he missed her during the day. Stopped waiting for him to notice her silence. Instead, she adjusted. When Ethan came home tired, she met him with calm. When he seemed distracted, she filled the space with light conversation. When he withdrew, she told herself, he just needs space. And maybe he did. But she needed presence. The problem was, her needs began to feel heavier than his comfort. So she lightened them. She became agreeable, flexible, low maintenance. She laughed at jokes that didn't land. She said, "It's okay," before she even checked if it was. She offered solutions instead of vulnerability. On the surface, the relationship felt smoother. Fewer difficult talks. Fewer tears. Fewer waves. Ethan relaxed more. He interpreted the quiet as stability. And Clara interpreted his relief as proof that she was finally doing it right. That's the subtle trap of becoming easy to love. You start measuring success by how little you disrupt. By how rarely you ask. By how small your emotions become. She told herself she was being mature. Strong women don't complain. Strong women don't need constant reassurance. Strong women handle things. But strength without expression becomes suppression. There were evenings when she wanted to say, "I miss us." Instead, she said, "Dinner's ready." There were mornings she wanted to reach for him and whisper, "Stay with me." Instead, she rolled to her side and checked her phone. Each unspoken sentence folded inward. Each swallowed feeling settled somewhere behind her ribs. She began to pride herself on being chill. Friends complimented her. "You're so balanced. You're so understanding." They didn't see the effort it took to be that balanced. They didn't see the rehearsed calm before conversations. The self-talk before expressing even the smallest need. What she was really becoming wasn't easier. She was becoming quieter. And quiet can look like peace. But sometimes quiet is just exhaustion wearing composure. The hardest part? Ethan loved this version of her. The composed one. The undemanding one. The one who never made him feel inadequate. And she loved him enough to keep becoming her smaller self. Until she couldn't remember what her full voice sounded like. 8. His version of care. Ethan did care. That was the part no one questioned. He remembered dates. He fixed broken things before she had to ask. He made sure her car was serviced. Her prescriptions refilled. Her favorite coffee stocked in the kitchen. His love showed up in logistics. If something went wrong, he moved quickly. If something broke, he repaired it. If something felt unstable, he reinforced it. In his mind, this was devotion. Clara saw it. She appreciated it. She thanked him. But gratitude and connection are not the same thing. One evening, she came home visibly shaken. A hard conversation at work had left her unsettled, fragile in a way she didn't fully understand. "I just felt invisible," she said quietly, sitting beside him on the couch. Ethan leaned forward immediately. What happened? Who said what? He was ready to analyze, to strategize, to solve. She tried to explain how the room felt, how her chest tightened, how small she became in that moment. He interrupted gently. "You shouldn't let that get to you. You're overthinking it." Not dismissive, just efficient. He believed he was helping her regain control. But what she needed wasn't control. She needed to be witnessed. There's a difference between solving someone's pain and sitting inside it with them. Ethan never learned that difference. To him, discomfort meant something was broken. And broken things required action. So when Clara cried, he reached for tissues and reassurance instead of silence and presence. When she expressed fear, he offered plans instead of proximity. When she said, "I'm scared," he said, "You'll be fine." And she usually was. But that wasn't the point. His version of care was protection. Shielding her from inconvenience. Shielding her from instability. Shielding her from feeling too much. But in doing so, he accidentally shielded himself from entering her emotional world. Because entering meant slowing down. And slowing down meant vulnerability. And vulnerability, to him, still felt unsafe. Clara began to notice that every time she brought something tender, it was redirected toward resolution. The emotion rarely stayed in the room long enough to breathe. It was processed, reframed, closed. She started choosing which feelings were worth bringing up. The dramatic ones got solutions. The quiet ones stayed inside her. And that's how misunderstanding grows. Not through lack of love, but through incompatible languages. Ethan cared deeply. He just expressed care in a way that never quite reached where she was hurting. 9. The body keeps score. Before Clara admitted anything to herself, her body already knew. It started with sleep. She would lie beside Ethan, the room dark and still, and feel a quiet tension humming under her skin. Not loud enough to panic, just constant enough to keep her awake. Her mind would replay conversations. The pause before he answered. The way he said, "You're overthinking it." The way she said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. She began waking up at 3:17 a.m. almost every night. No alarm, no noise. Just her nervous system refusing to rest. During the day, her shoulders stayed slightly raised, as if bracing for something unnamed. Her jaw ached from clenching. Her stomach tightened whenever she considered bringing up something vulnerable. Ethan would ask, "Are you feeling okay?" And she would smile. "I'm just tired." Technically true, but not complete. The body keeps score of what the heart suppresses. Every swallowed sentence settles somewhere. Every minimized need leaves a trace. Clara started noticing that her energy dipped around him, not because he was cruel, but because she was constantly calibrating herself. Is this too much? Is this safe to say? Will this create distance? Her body remained on alert even in moments that looked peaceful. They could be sitting on the couch, watching a show, and her chest would tighten without warning. Nothing was happening. And yet everything was. That's the strange thing about emotional unavailability. It rarely announces itself. It accumulates. In muscle memory. In breathing patterns. In the way your voice hesitates before telling the truth. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror at work. Her eyes looked older. Not aged by years. Aged by vigilance. She realized she had been monitoring the emotional climate of her relationship the way some people monitor weather patterns, constantly scanning for shifts. The body does that when it doesn't feel secure. It prepares. Even if there's no visible threat. Ethan noticed her restlessness but interpreted it as stress. "You should take a weekend off," he suggested. "Get a massage, relax." He meant well. But relaxation doesn't work when the tension isn't physical. It's relational. Clara wasn't exhausted from work. She was exhausted from adjusting. From carrying both her feelings and his comfort at the same time. Her body began whispering what her voice still wouldn't say. "You don't feel safe being fully seen here." And the longer she ignored that whisper, the louder it became. 10. The price of being strong. Clara became the strong one without realizing she was auditioning for the role. Strong meant, don't make it worse. Strong meant, don't ask twice. Strong meant, keep the peace. So she carried the relationship the way people carry fragile glass, carefully. Quietly, with both hands, hoping no one would bump into her. When Ethan forgot a detail that mattered to her, She smiled and said, "It's fine." When he didn't notice her sadness, she told herself, "He's busy." When she needed reassurance, she swallowed it and called it independence. Strength became her language. But strength has a cost. It costs you your softness. Not the softness that makes you weak. The softness that makes you honest. Clara stopped letting her voice tremble. Stopped letting silence be awkward. Stopped letting her needs take up air. Because needs felt risky. Needs invited disappointment. And disappointment, for her, was starting to feel like a pattern she couldn't survive again. So she learned to preempt pain. She anticipated his withdrawal and backed away first. She sensed his discomfort and made jokes to lighten the room. She felt tears coming and went to the bathroom before they could be seen. From the outside, she looked composed. Inside, she was running a constant emotional marathon. Holding herself together is work. Holding two people together is another kind of work entirely. There were nights she would lie awake and think, "If I just say it better, he'll understand." She rewrote conversations in her head like scripts. She practiced softer phrasing. She removed anything that sounded like blame. She added extra understanding, extra patience, like padding around a fragile truth. But even the gentlest truth can feel sharp to someone who isn't ready to hear it. And every time she tried, she felt him pull away, not in anger, but in that familiar shutting down. So she tried less. Until being strong wasn't a choice anymore. It was a survival strategy. The price showed up in small places. In how she stopped calling her friends, because she didn't want to sound repetitive. In how she stopped crying, because it felt useless. In how she stopped expecting warmth, because expecting made the cold hurt more. Strength made her functional, but it also made her lonely. Because what she needed wasn't more endurance. She needed to be held. Not fixed. Not managed. Held. And that's the cruel math of emotional unavailability. The more you try to be strong enough for both of you, the less room there is for you to be a person. 11. The argument that wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of fight people notice. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No cruel words thrown like knives. It was quieter than that. Which made it more dangerous. It started with something small, something that shouldn't have mattered. Clara had planned a simple dinner. Candles, not to be dramatic, just to make the room feel warm again. She'd worn the sweater Ethan once said made her look soft. She didn't want romance. She wanted closeness. Ethan came in late, jacket still on, phone in hand. "Hey," he said, kissing her cheek like a checkbox. His eyes didn't meet hers. Clara waited, just a second longer than usual, hoping he'd notice the candles, the effort, the invitation. He didn't. He glanced at the table and said, "Oh, you did a lot." Not gratitude, not curiosity. An observation. She felt something tighten behind her ribs. "It's just dinner," she said, careful. Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked down. His thumb moved. Clara watched the thumb. That tiny motion carried more attention than she did. "Can you not right now?" she asked. Still calm. He looked up, surprised, like she'd interrupted something important. "I'm listening," he said. But his tone carried a warning. "Don't make this into a thing." Clara swallowed, then tried again, softer. "I just miss you." A pause. Ethan set the phone down. Slowly, like he was choosing peace. "I'm here," he replied. "Why are we doing this?" There it was. The subtle accusation. Not, "Tell me more." Not, "I didn't realize." But why are you creating a problem? Clara felt her face go numb, not from anger, but from that familiar loneliness. "I'm not trying to fight," she said. "I'm trying to reach you." Ethan exhaled through his nose. A controlled, careful breath. "I can't do this tonight," he murmured. Not because he didn't have time. Because he didn't have capacity. He stood up, carried his plate to the sink, and began rinsing it as if motion could erase emotion. Clara stayed seated. The candles flickered. The room was warm. And yet she felt cold. Ethan, she said, quiet, not pleading, do you know what it feels like when you shut down like that? He froze for a second. Then he turned slightly, not fully facing her. I'm not shutting down, he said, I'm trying to keep this from becoming a bigger fight. He thought he was being reasonable. Clara realized something in that moment. He saw her feelings as conflict. He saw her longing as pressure. And the way he protected himself from pressure was to disappear emotionally. So the argument ended the way it always did. Not with resolution. With retreat. Ethan went to the bedroom early. Clara stayed at the table until the candles burned low, watching the wax pool like time melting. No one screamed. But something broke anyway. And it wasn't loud. It was the sound of a door closing softly from the inside. 12 When love feels one-sided. After that quiet argument, Clara didn't leave. She stayed. But something shifted. She stopped expecting the next moment to repair the last one. She started moving through the relationship the way you move through a house at night, careful not to bump into anything sharp. Ethan acted normal the next morning. Coffee, headlines, a quick kiss by the door. No mention of the candles. No mention of her words. No acknowledgement of the distance he had created. It was as if the night before had been erased. And Clara realized, he wasn't avoiding the fight. He was avoiding her reality. Love began to feel one-sided in the smallest, most exhausting ways. She listened to his stories from work, asked questions, remembered names, laughed at the right places. When she spoke, he nodded, then offered solutions, or drifted, or changed the subject with gentle efficiency. She bought the birthday gift for his mother. She planned the vacations. She checked in after his hard meetings. She was doing the emotional labor of two people. Not because she wanted to control everything, but because if she didn't hold it, it fell. Some nights, she would sit on the edge of the bed and look at him sleeping. His face looked peaceful. And she hated herself for resenting that peace. Because she loved him. That was the cruel part. You can't easily walk away from someone you still love. But you also can't keep pouring yourself into a cup that never fills. Clara started noticing the imbalance like a weight on her chest. When she was sad, she comforted herself. When he was stressed, she rearranged her life to support him. When she needed warmth, she created it, candles, music, soft questions. When he needed space, she gave it instantly. Her needs had become negotiable. His had become law. And the more she tried to be understanding, the less she felt understood. She began to wonder if she was asking for too much. Not money, not time. Just emotional reciprocity. To be met halfway. To be held in the same tenderness she offered. One afternoon, she tried an experiment. She stopped reaching first. She didn't initiate conversation. Didn't send the "thinking of you" text. Didn't ask how his day was until he asked hers. Hours passed. Then a full day. Ethan didn't seem upset. He seemed comfortable. That's when it hit her. Her effort had been the glue. And without it, there was nothing loud enough to call it a crisis. Just a slow, quiet separation happening under the same roof. Love wasn't gone. But partnership was thinning. And Clara began to understand the difference between being loved and being accompanied. 13 Saying the word, abandonment. Clara practiced the sentence in her head for days. Not because she wanted drama. Because she wanted precision. There was a point where pain stops being survivable unless you name it. So she waited for a moment that felt calm, no deadlines. No phones ringing, no rushing out the door. A quiet Sunday afternoon. Ethan was at the kitchen counter, reading emails even though he'd promised he wouldn't. The light through the window landed on his hands. Steady, capable, doing what they always did, holding the world together. Clara stood behind him for a moment, watching the familiar posture of a man who could organize everything except feelings. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "Yeah?" Her throat tightened. This was the part where she usually softened it, joked, made it smaller. But she didn't. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to just listen." she said. His expression changed, subtle, guarded. Okay. Clara took a breath that felt too big for her chest. I feel abandoned. The word landed like a dropped glass. Ethan blinked. Once. Twice. Abandoned, he repeated, as if tasting it for accuracy. Clara nodded, eyes wet but steady. Yes, and I know how that sounds. I know you come home. I know you provide. I know you're not cheating. I know you're not leaving. She swallowed. But I feel alone in this relationship. Ethan's jaw tightened, the way it did when he was trying to stay controlled. That's not fair, he said quietly. And there it was. Not curiosity, not concern. Defense. Clara felt her hands shake slightly, but she kept her voice soft. I'm not accusing you of being a bad person, she said. I'm telling you what it feels like to live next to someone who won't meet me emotionally. He stared at her, like she'd spoken a foreign language. I'm here, he said again. I don't understand what you want from me. Clara almost laughed, not because it was funny. Because it was painful how sincere he sounded. I want you to turn toward me, she whispered. When I'm trying to reach you, I want you to come closer, not shut down. Ethan looked away for a moment, like the words were too bright. I don't shut down, he replied. I just don't want to fight. I'm not asking to fight, Clara said. I'm asking to be seen. Silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that weighs. Ethan's fingers tapped the edge of the counter. Restless. I'm doing everything I can, he said finally, voice low. I don't know why it's never enough. That sentence cracked something open in Clara. Because it wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Fear of failing. Fear of being inadequate. And she could feel both truths at once. He was trying. And she was still starving. I don't need perfection, she said, almost a plea. I need presence. Ethan didn't answer. He just stood there, caught between love and the skills he never learned. And Clara realized naming abandonment didn't make her safer. It made the distance visible. And once you can see it, you can't pretend it isn't there. 14 the day she stopped asking. After she said the word, abandonment, Clara expected something to change. Not instantly. Not magically. Just a shift. A crack of light. A sign that Ethan understood the seriousness beneath her softness. Instead, the days that followed felt strangely normal. Ethan didn't punish her. He didn't lash out. He didn't leave. He simply returned to routine, as if naming the wound didn't require touching it. He made breakfast. He answered calls. He asked, "How's your day?" with the same steady tone. And Clara realized something terrifying. A person can hear your truth and still not receive it. So she stopped asking. Not as a tactic. Not to teach him a lesson. But because her body finally understood that reaching was costing her more than it was giving. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday. She was folding laundry in the bedroom, stacking his shirts with that familiar care, when Ethan walked in and said, "We should book our flights for April." That was it. No, I've been thinking. No, I'm sorry. No, tell me again what you meant. Just logistics. Clara held one of his shirts in her hands, white, crisp, perfectly ironed, and felt a sudden clarity. This is who he is in moments that require depth. He organizes. He moves forward. He avoids the emotional room entirely. Something inside her went quiet. Not numb. Not angry. Quiet in the way a door closes gently after too many knocks. Ethan kept talking about dates and prices, not noticing that Clara had stopped responding with her usual warmth. Finally he asked, "Are you okay?" She looked at him, really looked. And she saw it, the honest confusion. The genuine belief that he was being a good partner. If she explained again, he would defend. If she insisted, he would withdraw. If she cried, he would try to fix it. And none of that would be what she needed. So Clara chose the most painful form of peace. She stopped requesting. No more, can we talk? No more, do you miss me? No more, please look at me. She became polite. She became functional. She became someone who could be lived with. Ethan interpreted it as things getting better. He relaxed. He smiled more. He praised her calm. And Clara felt the final loneliness settle in. He loved her most when she asked for the least. That's when she understood the quiet tragedy of their dynamic. Her love made her smaller. His love stayed the same size. That night, she lay in bed beside him and didn't reach for his hand. Not because she wanted to punish him. Because she didn't want to feel that familiar emptiness again. She stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, barely audible, "I'm done begging to be met." And somewhere deep in the silence, a new truth formed. When you stop asking, you're not giving up on love. You're giving yourself back. 15. The call he almost missed. Clara didn't plan the day everything cracked. It wasn't an anniversary. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't some dramatic turning point she could predict. It was ordinary. Which is how most heartbreaks arrive. She had left the office late. The sky already turning that soft gray blue that makes the whole city feel like it's holding a secret. Her phone was at 2%. She told herself she'd make it home before it died. Then her car stalled at a red light. No warning, no slow decline. One moment it was moving. The next, the engine gave a small cough and went silent. Traffic behind her honked. Clara's hands tightened on the wheel. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. She looked around. People were impatient. A few faces turned away like her inconvenience was contagious. Her chest tightened, not from fear of danger, but from that old, familiar feeling. I'm alone in this. She reached for her phone. 2%, 1 bar. She didn't want to call Ethan. Not because she didn't trust him. Because she didn't trust what it would cost her to need him. But the cars kept honking, and the light kept changing, and her hands started to shake. So she called. It rang once. Twice. Then went to voicemail. Clara stared at the screen, stunned by how fast her body reacted. Not anger, not surprise. A sinking acceptance. She didn't leave a dramatic message. Her voice came out steady, almost polite. Ethan, it's me. My car stalled at the light on 7th and Maple. I could really use you right now. She hung up before her voice could break. Then she remembered, he always had meetings late on Tuesdays. He'd told her, she'd listened, she'd adjusted. So she tried again. This time, it rang longer. 3, 4, 5. She imagined him looking at the caller ID, hesitating, thinking, I can't handle this right now. And just as the phone was about to drop again, he answered. Hey, he said, breath tight. What's going on? Clara swallowed. The relief was sharp, almost painful. My car died, she said. I'm stuck in the middle of traffic. A pause, then his voice shifted into action. Okay, stay calm. Put your hazards on. I'm sending a tow. Text me your exact location. She waited for something else. A soft question. Are you scared? Are you okay? But Ethan was already in logistics. Clara closed her eyes. I don't need a tow first. She whispered. I need you. Silence. For a beat, there was nothing but the faint rush of air on his end. Then, quieter, he said, I'm in the middle of something. Clara's throat tightened. Of course he was. She looked at the red light cycling again, the honking behind her, her own heart beating too loud. Okay, she said softly, I'll handle it. She hated how calm she sounded. Because calm had become her armor. Ethan hesitated. Clara, I'm trying. And she believed him. That was the tragedy. He was trying in the only way he knew. But what she needed wasn't help. It was presence. She opened her eyes and stared straight ahead, voice barely above a breath. Next time you hear me, she said, please don't make me feel like I'm interrupting your life. Then the line went quiet again. Not disconnected. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you exactly where you stand. 16. Hearing her in the silence. The apartment didn't look different after Clara left. That was what unsettled Ethan most. Her mug was still in the dish rack. A sweater still hung on the back of the chair like it might slip onto her shoulders again. The air still smelled faintly like the candle she loved, vanilla and something soft. But the space between sounds had changed. Silence, he learned, has layers. There's the silence of two people watching TV. The silence of a late night when the city finally sleeps. And then there's the silence that arrives when someone stops reaching. That one has weight. Ethan walked through the rooms like he was searching for something he'd misplaced. Not her keys, not her phone. Something less visible. He found her note on the counter. No anger, no threat. Just a sentence that felt like a bruise. I can't keep feeling alone next to you. He reread it twice, then a third time, like repetition could turn it into a problem he could solve. His instinct rose, call her. Fix it, make a plan. But something stopped him. Because this wasn't logistics. This was presence. And presence couldn't be sent like a tow truck. That night, he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the last time he had truly looked at her. Not glanced, not checked in. Looked. He remembered her voice saying his name in the doorway. The softness in it, the way it never tried to shame him, only invite him. He remembered the candles, the dinner, the small ways she tried to make the room feel like them again. And the moment he didn't turn around. At first, he told himself he hadn't meant to hurt her. But intention didn't change impact. He began to hear things he used to miss. The pause after she spoke. The way, I'm fine, sounded thinner every month. The way her laughter arrived fast. Like it was covering something. He had confused calm with closeness. He had confused staying with showing up. Now, in the quiet, there was no distraction to hide behind. No meeting, no email, no phone buzz that could save him from feeling. And that's when grief arrived, not because she died, but because something real had. A version of them. A version of her that still believed he would eventually turn toward her. He wanted to call. He even dialed once. Then he stopped. Because for the first time, he realized, the call shouldn't be to bring her back into the same silence. The call should be to learn how to listen, before love turns into an echo. Ethan sat there, breathing slowly, hearing the apartment breathe back. And in that silence, he finally understood what Clara had been trying to say all along. You can love someone? And still abandon them. Not by leaving. But by staying unreachable. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt alone next to someone, or realized you were the one who couldn't show up, please don't keep it quiet. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the words, and comment one honest sentence. Have you ever asked for presence and received silence? And if you want more stories that whisper the truth, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Because sometimes healing starts the moment we finally listen.